Thanks, Dr. Rahul, for unmuting. I've been struggling to get access to get unmuted. Can you all hear me and can we start? Hello?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, right. So are Vinny and Rashmi still the people who will coordinate today?
Yeah, yes, ma'am. They will coordinate today.
Okay, all right. So I'm sharing the screen now. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you. Okay, so today we are starting with child and infant mortality. So when we look at child and infant mortality, some of the key things that we have to remember, the summary is what I'm starting with so that we know where we are and what still needs to be done globally. So first of all, on a daily basis, 15,000 children are dying. Now this was the stats before COVID. Now we don't know what the stats are because knowing how the healthcare systems are functioning around the world, we don't even have access to reliable data. So we don't know where this is heading at the moment. So this is one reality. But the second reality is when compared to the year 1990, when we look at the when we trace the progress we have made up to 2015, for which we have the stats at this point, there has definitely been a decline towards the child mortality or the infant mortality. But at what age are these children dying? So a quarter of all children died in the first year of life, and almost half of them died before reaching the end of puberty. So that was the age group in which children were dying. But despite all of these issues, in the last 2 centuries, we have made a lot of progress. Now, this sounds really um, as if we are talking about some uh, prehistorical phase. You know, we are talking about in the last 2 centuries, we have made rapid progress. It doesn't tell us in the last 2 decades, we have made excellent progress. I don't know when we will be able to say that. And now, thanks to COVID, that is not going to happen anytime in the future. So if you look at where were we before, I mean, from 1800 to 1950 in the first place, because generally whatever I present to you is from 1950 to 2015. So from 1800 to 1950, what was the global mortality for children? It was 43%. So it took 150 years to bring it down to half of it, 22.5%. And then since 1950, the mortality rate has declined fivefold to 4.5% in 2015. So when you look at the overall progress we have made in 2 centuries, mind you, we're not talking of 2 decades, we're not talking of 20 years here, we are talking of 200 years here. We needed 200 years to bring it down to 4.5%. And child mortality rates and fertility rates were very high. So fertility rates had to be high because for all the number of children that mothers were losing, they had to keep giving birth in order to still have a few children left. So in Europe, in the mid 18th century, parents lost an average between 3 and 4 of their children. That was the average loss of children that every mother went through or every parent went through. I tend to stick to what every mother went through because at the end of the day, as painful as it is for the father does not go through the pregnancy or the childbirth. So I will still stick to the mother in this case. And 5.4 million children died in 2017, and the most common cause was pneumonia, preterm births, and neonatal disorders, which is the second, and diarrhea, which is the third. So this is something to bear in mind when you want to think of therapeutics and you want to think of what kind of medicines should be available at all health levels, especially the primary health care and the sub-center, because that is where, especially in India or in any country where these problems are existing, it is in the lower levels of healthcare that we need to focus on. It is not about focusing on how well our hospitals are performing, because the child very rarely reaches the hospital when the child has pneumonia or preterm births or diarrheal diseases. More often than not, they're all still stuck in the sub-centers and the primary healthcare centers. So just in 1 year, we lost 5.4 million children in 2017. Right. So what has been happening here? Where did we start and where have we ended? So this particular one is from 1990, and I have looked at where were we in 1990, more than 12 million deaths in the world, and how that has dropped to about a little more than 5 million deaths. 5.3 million is what we were talking about, 5.3 million deaths in a year. That was the world. But if you look at where were we with respect to the heavily indebted poor countries, that shows you something that we all need to understand. If the country, yesterday also when I spoke to you about the fragile states and tried to link between Sudan and South Sudan, if you recollect well, South Sudan had double or more than that of the number of maternal deaths when compared to Sudan, because Sudan was a big country. From Sudan, they carved out South Sudan. It became a new country. When it became a new country, because of whatever political unrest was happening there, that same political unrest results in more mothers dying in South Sudan when compared to Sudan, just in the northern borders. So that is the difference. So take a look here at the heavily indebted poor countries. The minute developing countries are heavily indebted, now who are they indebted to? They are indebted to the World Bank, to all the, to IMF, International Monetary Fund. So here, Vinny and Rashmi, could one of you please unmute yourselves? Are you aware of what are the different organizations I'm talking about? The World Bank, International Monetary Fund, etc. And why would these countries be indebted? What is the debt that is happening there?
Ma'am, can you repeat the question?
The question is, when I say on the right-hand side, can you see my cursor now?
Yes,
are you able
ma'am.
to see the cursor where I'm showing heavily indebted poor countries, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So when I say heavily indebted poor countries, who are they indebted to? Where do these countries borrow the money? Have you heard of International Monetary Fund and the World Bank?
Yes.
ma'am.
You have? Yes?
About the World Bank, yes, ma'am.
Okay. What do they do?
Ma'am, they help financially to the country.
Help financially. Is that a help?
No, ma'am.
Can we rephrase and stop being politically correct?
They loan money.
Exactly. They loan money in dollars, right? Now let us just take India, for example. If we say we're getting a World Bank loan, it will come in dollars to India. But when we repay, first of all, the interest, forget the principal amount, the interest every year when India has to repay to the World Bank, will it be in Indian rupees? If they are giving a loan in dollars, what is the repayment currency?
Ma'am, dollars?
Definitely. So what is our, how many rupees do we need for $1?
Ma'am, is it around 64?
You're talking of at least 50 years ago. Take a look and say, everything is at your fingertips. You just have to Google and you will know what is the conversion rate for $1. Now, something I would like your generation to look at. Take a look at the BRICS countries. When I say BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. All right? Take a look at between India and South Africa. Don't even go all the way to looking at the BRICS countries, just India and South Africa. we keep talking as if, we are so great because we can launch satellites. We are the people for medical tourism. We have all pharmaceutical companies here and we can manufacture any kind of formulation, though we depend on China for all the APIs. So we boast of many things. Take a look at in South Africa, how many rands do they need to get $1? And sitting in India, where we can boast of all these things, which even South Africa does not have. South Africa has not launched all those satellites we can talk about, does not have any of the pharmaceutical companies we talk about. Whatever boasting points we have, they don't have, right? But take a look at how many rands, RANDS, that is their currency, that they need for $1. So who will tell me? Because you all have your internet and your mobile phones in your hand. Who will tell me quickly, just between two countries, India and South Africa, how many rupees do we need for $1? How many rands does a South African need for $1?
Ma'am, for $1, around 70 to 75.
Yes, we need about 75 rupees for $1. And rands?
Ma'am, 1 rand is 0.06.
No, don't go that way. How many rands will give us $1? Just like you said, about 75 rupees is what we need for $1. Just type rand to dollar conversion. How many rands do you need for $1?
Ma'am, 16.
16, right? So that is the difference. Can you see how they need just 16 of their currency to get $1? Whereas even with 60, we will still not get $1. We have to add another 15 rupees to that. 75 is what we need for $1. Okay. So next time we want to act arrogant, let us put our tail between our legs and walk by thinking, okay, what are we doing here? Where are we messing up the taxpayers' money and keeping the level of the rupee so low that we need 75 rupees for $1? And when you get all these World Bank and IMF loans, they're not coming in any small amounts. They're all coming in thousands of dollars. And we are paying interest in thousands of dollars. And whose money is that? Your money and my money, right? It's a taxpayer's money. No government is minting the money. They all have to wait for the taxpayer to pay. Only then the money comes into their budget. So this is where we have been playing the system. We keep countries poor. We keep countries eternally indebted. And despite all the progress we have made in India, our currency is, we need 75 of our currency for just $1. So next time we do the mistake of telling World Bank and IMF is helping us, we really have to kick ourselves before we say that. They are not helping us. They fly business class. They stay in developed countries. They breathe clean air and have fresh water and good. The best fruits and vegetables of India are found in the developed country markets. So when you go to England and buy those things at throwaway prices, when you're taking it at a pound level, whereas even if we pay 100 times more of that, we who live on this soil don't eat the best fruits and the best vegetables that come from our soil. We export it because we want those dollars. We keep our currency low so we can get more dollars when it comes into the country. So we constantly subsidize rich countries. Can somebody repeat my last sentence and what it means to them? Are rich countries rich because they were always rich, or in the last 500 years they became rich? Especially in the last 200 to 300 years. Who wants to take a go at that? I know it's not pharmacy practice, but you live on this planet, so you need to know what is happening and therefore then connect it to health. Who wants to take a go at, were all the rich countries today, the so-called developed countries, always rich? Yes or no? Vinny and Rashmi, you also choose to stay quiet. At least tell me you want me to answer my own question, I'll do it. But silence doesn't help any one of us. I'm just checking if you're all still here, because if I'm just talking to myself, then I'm lost.
No, ma'am.
Okay. So all of you are still here. Good. I wanted to know how many people are here. There are 61 people other than me, right? So were rich countries always rich, or did they become rich?
They became rich, ma'am.
Who made them rich?
Ma'am, the other countries.
Yes. We, the so-called developing poor countries, we made them rich. So I like Shashi Tharoor. I like following and listening to the way he speaks. So just Google some of the YouTube presentations that Shashi Tharoor gave in Oxford. And then you can start looking at how the unilateral trade and where it led. And then you will start connecting how these heavily indebted poor countries remain where they are and what happens to their child rates. So you can see that in 1990s where they were. And by the year 2000, it went up. And only then it has started coming down. So there must be a reason why that happened. And that's the reason I've included that in this particular graph. Because if you see the world has been constantly dipping from a little more than or close to 13 million to a little more than 5 million. So that is a constant dip. If you look at the upper middle income countries, so India definitely doesn't come under the upper middle income. India is a low middle income country. So the upper middle income countries like Egypt, China, Brazil, etc., they had a steady dip, then they plateaued a little bit, and then they dipped again. So they reduced their child deaths. If you look at South Africa, for example, here, they have had a steady decline consistently and made sure that they are closer to their targets. In case of India, we had closer to 4 million deaths in 1990s, and even we have been declining slowly, and now we are a little more than 1.5 million. So everything is showing either a steady dip or some kind of a dip. Nothing is showing an increase. But if you look at the heavily indebted poor countries, I want you to understand that from 1990s to 2000, they were increasing, and only then they have started decreasing. So a lot of these increases here is based on the fact that these countries are borrowing huge amounts of money from organizations like World Bank, IMF, etc. Their healthcare systems are poorly resourced. They have terrible brain drain. Their primary healthcare systems are not functional. They're functional to the extent that they can save their women and children from dying. Their essential medicines availability is always inconsistent. It is all of these factors put together when a country is paying huge amounts of debt in dollars, when their currency is very weak. This is who pays the price. So that is what I wanted to show with this particular graph. I hope the point has come through clearly and strongly. All countries in the world in general were declining. India was declining. Upper middle income countries were declining very fast. I'm going to show later on one of the graphs where I show the difference between India and Malaysia, for example. And then South Africa consistently declining. They were so low to start with in the first place, but only the heavily indebted countries increased in the number of children that died, and only now they have started declining. So Keep this in mind while I talk to you about the other slides now. Now, if you look at 2017 and you see what has been going on, the child mortality rate expresses the probability of a child born in a specific year or period dying before reaching the age of 5 years. So we are talking about before reaching the age of 5, how many children are dying. So if you look at the stats here, again, all these dark blue countries where there are very few deaths of less than 1%, they're all in the so-called developed countries. So North America, Canada, Europe, Saudi Arabia, Australia, New Zealand. So all of these come under that category. Then with India, you see this light blue. So these are less than 5% deaths. But if you see these yellow and orange colors, they're all in sub-Saharan Africa, and here in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and some of the places here, Papua New Guinea, etc. So these are the places where you see the most number of children that die below the age of 5. Now, this is a very interesting graph. This shows what happens when you look at the age of the people who are dying in this planet. So in the year 2017, 56 million people died. So if you look at these 56 million people and what age group they belong to, you see that the highest number here is under the age group of 80 to 84 years. And the reason for that is because of the increasing life expectancy, people are able to live up to 80 and 84 years. So that's why you see the biggest one here. The next biggest one is this particular group, which is 75 to 79 years, because again, life expectancy globally has increased. Now take a look at under 5 years. Under 5 years is a lot more than the 72 to 74 year deaths. Can you see in the bar diagram here, right? So 70 to 74 is here, whereas the under 5s are dying more than the 70 to 74 years, and then drastically drops. Between the 5 to 9 years, the numbers are just 4,12,100. And then it drops even further for the 10 to 14 years to 3,19,600. Then it starts climbing slowly and then reaches the highest at 80 to 84 years. It means that below 5 years, most of the children in this planet are dying. And that is completely unacceptable, because this graph should not be at this point. Right. Now, where do we see these deaths? So again, I've taken Niger. Niger is in the African continent. Mali is in Africa. Again, Niger has had 32.65% in 1990. And they have consistently reduced, and now they're just 8.45%. Mali has been the next country. Mozambique, again in Africa. Angola is in Africa. Nigeria. The reason I considered Nigeria here to highlight is because it's again a country with a very high population as well as birth rates. And then heavily indebted poor countries. They were at 18.17%, and they have dipped slowly now. Finally, Pakistan, which was at 13.9%, and India was at 12.6% in 1990s. And India has dropped. So we are closer here to the 3.91% of the world. The world was at 9.32%. South Africa was way lower than India, half of India, the number of children that were lost. India was 12.6%, South Africa was 6.09% at 1990. What I want to drive home here is, we were a free country in 1990. We had got our independence in 1947. South Africa was still under apartheid in 1990. 80% of its population are Black people. Despite apartheid, despite whatever political unrest was happening there, the number of children dying there was just half of what was dying in who were dying in India. That is really pathetic statistics. If it just shows how poor we are in our attitude towards letting this happen. And then look at Sri Lanka, a small country, an island with hardly any resources that you can talk about when compared to India. It was just 2.13%. we were 12.6% of our children were dying, while for Sri Lanka, 2.13%. And then I've shown Japan here, 0.63%. And how by 2017, all those numbers have surely decreased, but how pathetic we were in 1990, right? Now, let's look at where are we at the moment. The number of births in the world is expected to stagnate between 2015 to 2030. Now, bear in mind, 2015 to 2030 is also the Sustainable Development Goal phase for us. So every year we will be losing every year there will be 140 million births. So this is what we spoke yesterday as well about when we were talking about maternal mortality. We said that every year 140 million women will be giving birth in the planet. So if global child mortality rate remains at the level as we are at the beginning of the SDG era, which is 4.5%, then we will have 6.3 million child deaths every year. And by 2030, in that 15-year period, 100 million child deaths would have happened. Now, bear in mind, if our stats were to have stagnated at where we were before the beginning, not before, at the beginning of the SDG era at 4.5%. But now, because of COVID, if you start correlating what is happening in the healthcare system, where are the funds being transferred, how the economy of countries is just falling flatter, how countries like India, which had such a good GDP rise, is going flat. We will be lesser than Bangladesh very soon with that kind of rise that we were having, whereas the dip that we are now having because of our economic reasons, with the social distancing, with the businesses that can't open, with people getting more and more infected. With those numbers, we will definitely not stagnate. These numbers are meant to increase. So whatever progress we achieved until now, we're going to lose all of that progress because of the COVID era. So we will have to now look at not SDG era, but COVID era and say, how do we get out of this phase in 2 years? How can we reduce the damage that is going to happen to every national health program while we are trying to address COVID, because this is the primary focus we need to have. In a pandemic, nothing else matters. You just have to deal with the pandemic. But then all the national health programs related to women, children, tuberculosis, malaria, you name it, especially the vaccination program for children, everything is getting stalled very badly. So these numbers are going to get worse. They are not going to be what we are expecting it to be. So if you look at number of children dying globally, there are different scenarios given. The first scenario is stagnation that I just spoke to you about, where our stagnation is at 4.5% deaths of children, and where we will be losing a total of 100 million children between the years 2015 to 2030, based on the fact that our public sector, midwives, you name it, whatever programs, access to essential drugs, all of that, if it remains as it was in 2015, we would have lost 100 million children in that phase. Whereas the United Nations was trying to have a different projection to bring it down. And then there is a third scenario. If we go the USA path, in the US, if you see how they went about with their programs, and they have been able to reduce the number of deaths of their children. And then there is a Western European path, which is much more better than the US. So this shows, this particular one I chose to show that when it comes to public health programs, what you will find in Western Europe is way ahead of what you would find in the US. And that is exactly what you're seeing with the COVID-related cases as well. Even in the COVID-related cases, the way Western Europe has been able to manage it is not the way the US has been able to manage it. So we have to start looking at that. But here, what you have to bear in mind is the Sustainable Development Goal was looking at this green dotted line here. They wanted to achieve this reduction of 2.5% deaths, not at 4.5% deaths if we were to keep stagnating there. And this is This is the wish list. But the problem is the wish list is not taking into consideration COVID, because this was the wish list in 2015. We want to look at how can we bring it down to 2.5% deaths rather than 4.5% of the number of child deaths. And now, yeah, it is up to anybody to guess and whatever stats we're going to find. What are the historical estimates of mortality? So here is an interesting paper which was written by Walk and Atkins. They were saying how, on an average, 26.9% of newborns died in their first year of birth, and 46.2% died before they reach adulthood. Now we are talking about historical estimates here. But remember, a quarter died in the first year of life, and about half died as children below 5 years or before they reached puberty. And the fertility rate was about 6 children per woman on an average. Now, if we kept a fertility rate of just 4 children per woman, our population would have doubled in each generation. If we went at 6 children per woman, then we would have had a tripling of our population from one generation to the next. But our population went up only by 0.04% annually, from 10,000 BCE, before Christ, to 1,700. Our population went up only by 0.4% annually. And therefore, though women were having more than 6 children, we did not have a huge explosion in the population that we have seen in the last 50 years, 50 to 70 years on this planet. The reason for that is a high share of children died before they could have their own children. But today, on the other hand, globally, 95.4% of all the children survived the first 15 years of age. And that is why we are having this kind of a population explosion. Now here's a graph that shows you the difference between 1950 child mortality and 2015 child mortality. So in India, it was 29, we went down to 4.8. If you see other countries like USA, for example, here was at 4%, they went to 0.7%. Canada was 5%, they went to 0.5%. So every country has shown that particular decrease. So where we see is the sub-Saharan Africa. So there we still see these colors that have not changed. And here what has been high has come down to this level. Now what is happening here? The fertility rate has come down from 6 children per woman to 2 to 3 children per woman. What is the reason for that change? The reason for that change is the living standards have improved, medical knowledge has improved, caregiving for women as well as for children has improved, nutrition has gotten better, water and sanitation has gotten better, and treatment of the diseases are possible. And mainly here, the 2 major things that were game changers were vaccinations and antibiotics. That is what transformed the outcomes for the mother and the children. So this particular graph here, it shows you that the share surviving first 5 years of life was how in 2017 it has changed. So you have a large percentage here of 96.09% who are able to survive the first 5 years. The ones that succumb here and die is just 3.91%. So that is what is happening. And the reason for that is all of these. And this is where I want you to bear in mind. When you are studying as a pharmacist, don't go with this biomedical model and the arrogance that for every disease, there is a medicine. And the minute you have access to medicine, everything is sorted. Absolutely not. This particular graph should cut out that ego of ours, which is completely misplaced, where we trust only medicines to be the problem solvers. Medicines are one of the problem solvers. It has its own place. It has its important place. It has its non-negotiably important place, all of it accepted. but it is not the only problem solver. If our living conditions are better, if the mother understands, when we talk of medical knowledge on one side, we have to talk of how there has been a progress, with the story telling that I did for you in the infant mortality rate one, where in Vienna, the biggest maternal hospital in the world, what they did. So all of those things have changed. Our medical knowledge has changed, but also what we have to bear in mind here is the health literacy is slowly increasing. And if our nutritions get better, if the water and the sanitation gets better, that is when the medicines can also do its part and we can reduce the problems here. So let us not go with the biomedical model, or more important, let us not go with the arrogance of that biomedical model. Let us give it its place of pride, but not go with the arrogance. So what has worked? So here I'm just giving you a bit of a history. Like in Sweden, in the 18th century, every third child died. By the 19th century in Germany, every second child died. If you look here with the declining poverty, so we spoke about better living conditions and increasing education, knowledge, services in the health sector, things have been getting better. So from 19% mortality rates in 1960, it has gone to below 4% in 2017. But still 4% is still quite a substantial, it's a substantial achievement. But these have been slow improvements. So what I want to show here is how these improvements have been slow. For example, big countries like Brazil and China reduced their child mortality rates 10-fold over. But in sub-Saharan Africa, the child mortality has been continuously falling. 1 in 4 children died in early 60s. Today, it is less than 1 in 10. So there has definitely been progress, but the progress has been slow. So the reason you will not find these in the newspapers is because the headlines will not sell. The newspaper will not sell because there is nothing sensational about this. So if you say the global child mortality rate fell by 0.0008% points since yesterday, the headlines is not going to change, is not going to sell the newspaper. So no one will talk about these things, which is absolutely slow. Now, this is the slide I told you at the beginning, where I said, I will talk to you about India, and then I will show you what happened in Malaysia. So this shows from 1800s to the 2000, how many years it took for each of these countries to have a reduction in their child mortality. So the slide reads as, how long did it take for child mortality to fall from every third child, 1 in 3, dying before their 5th birthday, to every 20th child, 1 in 20, dying before their 5th birthday? For United Kingdom, it took 148 years. For Sweden, it took lesser, 135 years. France was similar to UK. Canada took lesser, 119 years. USA took even lesser, 84 years. Take a look at Japan here, just 55 years to bring that change. Germany took even lesser at 50 years. There we are, India, 103 years. Things happen very slowly here. And for what we should be doing quickly, we slow down even further. Now, this is where I want to compare it with South Africa. They took only 76 years. So whatever arrogance we have, we better put it aside. We can launch satellites. We can manufacture any formulation on this planet. We can do all that we want. But we took how many years more? From 76 years that South Africa needed, we needed 103 years to reach the same numbers. And here we're talking of South Africa, where they got their independence only in 1994. Until then, they were in apartheid. They were in political unrest. There was absolutely no law to safeguard a Black woman or her child. Nobody could care about it. And in such pathetic conditions, they needed only 76 years. And we didn't have any of those conditions, and we took 103 years. So shame on us. Now take a look at Malaysia, a tiny country. It took only 37 years. Now, how much more shameful can we start getting is a question we want to ask ourselves. We talk about having so many medical colleges. We talk about having pharmacy colleges in every nook and corner. But we need 103 years to bring it down to a statistics that doesn't speak low about us. If Malaysia takes only 37 years with their tiny country and their resources, why are we not better than that? Why do we not question our policies, and why do we not change what needs to change? Now take a look at Kuwait. Kuwait took 30 years to make that change. Okay, South Korea is a different story. They needed only 25 years for that change. So this particular graph is to show us that there is no place for arrogance. Put the arrogance aside and start rolling up your sleeve and working, because if we needed 103 years to drop it, now post COVID, when our economic conditions are going to be worse, and women and the number of issues related to their job security, everything is going to be terrible. I don't know where we're going to go with these kind of stats. So let us be aware of where we have already gone wrong, and let us not push that button further post-COVID phase. Let us keep our finger on the pulse to make sure that the national health programs get the benefit of our time and energy. As a pharmacist, you should be contributing to these national health programs in whichever way you can. Whether you want to go and train the ASHA workers, you want to go and help the ASHA workers with the vaccination program, you want to volunteer in a closest primary healthcare center, even if you're doing it long distance. For example, I'm not going to go out into the field and start working just because I say these things, but I do stay inside my house, but I do all those training programs for free. So all of us have to find out what is our specific strength and contribute to these national programs. TB is going to go up terribly. HIV is going to go up terribly, because if people are not having the ability to come and access the free medicines, adherence is going to fall, then it is going to convert into multi-drug resistant TB and multi-drug resistant HIV. And then what those people will spread in the communities will be the multi-drug resistant. So we can't allow the TB program to suffer because COVID has gone out of control. So every time people feel like, oh, wearing a mask is so difficult, I can't push the damn thing above my nose, and it has to be below my nose and be my lip guard or my chin guard. Take a look at the ASHA worker who has to walk in the hot sun in the villages for COVID. Take a look at the nurse who could be pregnant, who could be menstruating, but who has to wear that PPE and struggle with that for the next 8 to 10 hours of the duty that she has to complete. So then we can stop acting arrogant or being stupid and pull our mask up from the bridge of the nose to all the way down to the chin. We have no reason to complain because we are not doing any of this. So somewhere down the line as pharmacists, it's time we feel ashamed of the fact that we are not part of this healthcare system to the extent that we should have been. We are not doing what we could have done. And what we can't change, we can't change. But what we can do from today going forward, we definitely should. There should be no stone left unturned to say, what am I good at? What can I do to contribute? Where can I improve whatever I can do? Everything is just a drop in the ocean. That is all we each are capable of. But let our drop not be diluted, at least when we give it. Let us give it wholeheartedly. So please keep this particular graph in your mind before you wake up or go to sleep or complain about anything in your life. We have far too many privileges. We have no right to complain. We only have to think of what can happen from here. Take a look at this particular stats. In 1990, in India, 3.4 million children were dying. So you can see this big area that we occupy on this planet. We should be ashamed of these particular stats. Take a look at little countries like Angola and Zambia. Where are they? A country like South Africa, where it is sitting here in a nice, neat corner because their programs are working much better than ours. And where are we sitting here like arrogant people where we are losing these many children? And then from 1990, with 3.4 million childbirths, in 2017, it comes down to 1 million child deaths. So we still sit here occupying a huge chunk of this graph that has been done extremely well to show how much of damage happens in every country. So the biggest damage in the world is happening sitting right here in India. The next one is in China. They were at 1.4 million deaths in 1990. Look at where we are and where we came. We started at 3.4 million in 1990 and went to 1 million. Whereas China, with a bigger population, had only 1.4 to start with. Their problem was where we are from 1990 to 2017, whatever little progress we did, they were already there. And now they have brought it down to 1,56,000. So if a country can do this with simple things like barefoot doctors, you don't need tertiary healthcare systems. You don't need out of this world medicines to make this change happen. All that you need is midwives. You need simple things that a mother understands, and you need basic medicines that we spoke about yesterday, the priority list of medicines. It's less than 27 medicines that should be available in the primary healthcare center to make sure the mothers and the children are not dying there. So take a look at this graph. This should put down any level of arrogance that we have or we can talk with, because numbers don't lie. These are numbers and they're not lying. So this is where we are. So what are these children dying from? So that we understand as a pharmacist, which are the medicines we should never allow to go below the safety stock. When we talk about hospital pharmacy and we think, it is boring to look at hospital pharmacy and safety stock. Why? Why is it boring? It has to be one of the life-giving elements, because certain medicines should never go out of stock. We have to make sure that there is a buffer stock maintained. So when it comes to the top killers of children and mothers, we have to ensure that those medicines never go out of stock. So first killer for children, 15% of all these, once I finish this slide, I'll be stopping. 15% of all the child deaths is from pneumonia and lower respiratory infections. So these are bacterial infections in nature, which means we need the basic antibiotics such as amoxicillin. We have to talk about access category of antibiotics. And next one, 12% of the deaths are from preterm births and neonatal disorders. These are 27 days after birth, the neonatal period. Now, we have to bear in mind, I've spoken to you yesterday as well as the previous week, how the preterm births have increased globally and they're increasing in India as well. And because of that, the number of children who are dying because they don't have access to simple things like oxygen. I'll be coming to that later on, next week on Tuesday when I show you the graphs for those things. Just lack of oxygen in the primary healthcare centers is one of the reasons children are not making it during the neonatal phase. So what are the preterm or the premature births? These are children born before the 37th week of gestation. It has become the major determinant of neonatal mortality at the moment. Now, what are the other problems these premature children have? They have a high risk of having birth injuries, underdeveloped organ failures, and attracting infectious diseases. And generally it is related to lungs, because in the last month during their gestation, the lung development doesn't take place because they have arrived preterm. They're in a mad rush to be in this planet. So when the lungs are not developed, then they end up with pneumonia and other lower respiratory infections, which are all bacterial in nature, and they definitely need those antibiotics. So as a pharmacist, making sure that those antibiotics remain in stock is what we need to take care. Then comes the 10% of deaths from diarrheal diseases. Now, when it comes to diarrhea, again, ORS and zinc, these are the two things that come under the priority list of medicines, which should be definitely available. Then the remaining there, what we see are all the infectious diseases. And for those infectious diseases, two things that did the magic in the last 50 to 100 years is the vaccination program that we have been having and the antibiotics that have been a lifesaver. Now, with the antimicrobial resistance, because of, again, our pathetic, greedy attitude, where we keep talking about pinpointing our finger to somebody else. We say, oh, doctors don't prescribe properly. Then the doctors point the finger to DCGI and say, why is the DCGI of India approving medicines that should not be there? If other countries are banning the medicines, why are we approving those medicines? Why are we marketing those medicines? So each of us are busy pointing the finger at others, not realizing three fingers are pointing at us. Every time we pick our hand to point a finger at somebody, three are at us. So when that is happening with the antibiotics, we have landed in this wonderful event of antimicrobial resistance. And then the majority of the antibiotics entering our body now is not from the antibiotics that you and I swallow as tablets and capsules. It is coming from the meat industry and the milk products and the food industry. So even if I'm a vegetarian, even if I don't eat meat, the amount of antibiotics entering my body doesn't stop. The reason is we are using it as growth promoters. So with all these extremely pathetic policies that we have, but even poorer attitude that we have, and the uncapped greed that we have shown, that we have demonstrated in the last 50 to 100 years, has landed us in this soup. It's a hot soup. Now it is there. Now we are inside it. Now it's a matter of how are we going to get out of it. And when we are trying to get out of it, when we are opening our eyes to the problem and seeing, okay, where do we stand in India with maternal death, child death, TB program, HIV program, national health programs, and now COVID has hit us. So the least we can do during this phase is understand what are these programs, because for whatever reason, they are not given the importance that they deserve in our curriculum. So at least if your university, if your principal, if your lecturers have opened the doors for you to have a better understanding of these things, which is outside the curriculum, try and make good use of it, because all of us are trying to, go to that next level without having more pathetic figures that shows up for India at the moment. So I'll stop it at this and then continue the rest on Tuesday next week. If there are any comments or anything else, I'm happy to hear. Yes, Rashmi, you have unmuted yourself already. So what is it that you are ready to say?
Ma'am, what are the current programs running to decrease the infant mortality rate, ma'am?
Current programs running, it is not running to the same level it ran under MDG. In MDG, it was extremely specific. They had MDG 4, which was to do with reducing infant mortality rates. They had MDG 5, which was to do with reducing maternal mortality rates. Compared to MDG, SDG is not focusing only on these things. SDG is focusing on health and well-being as a big picture. Whereas if you look at MDG, there are certain advantages that I see in MDG that I don't see in the Sustainable Development Goal and the way we are all heading. In Sustainable Development Goal, we are looking at how do we sustain ourselves on this planet, because we have become greedy, uncapped greed has taken over. So they want to sustain the planet. So if you look at what are the 17 goals from peace that they are talking about, to all the way to do with how do we have sustainable cities. They're focusing on those things because we have gone completely out of control. Everything is out of hand on this planet. We need 1.5 Earth to satisfy our greed. And very soon, with the population explosion that we are having, I don't know where we are heading. So SDG is not focusing only on health. SDG has given SDG 3 for health and well-being. And under SDG 3 for health and well-being, you don't have clear-cut things like they had in MDG. MDG, I really liked it because MDG 4 was infant mortality rate. MDG 5 was in maternal mortality rate. I could be mistaken now, but I think MDG 6 was to do with TB, HIV, and malaria. And then there was one of the MDGs, I'm unable to recollect it. I will definitely look it up and tell you the number. It was to do with essential medicines. They said that all the medicines that you need for addressing the major death and the diseases on this planet are essential medicines. So they focused on that. So there was a lot more congruence and alignment between what was happening between the MDGs and the way the programs were working. That kind of a congruence is lost now, because now we are trying to focus on how to make it sustainable rather than how to make it health centered. At the moment, this is not health centered. So at the moment, what do we have in our country? We will definitely have the vaccination program for children. And pathetic. I will get you the figures on Tuesday without fail, but from memory, I think we are only covering less than 70% of our children. We are not able to have 100% vaccination rates. How do we manage this? We are talking of 2020. Coke reaches every nook and corner, every village on this planet. But we can't get vaccination to the same village. Then something is wrong with us. Absolutely wrong with us. Coke is able to keep its Coke cold and give you cold Coke wherever you go. But how is it that vaccinations, even if they reach these villages, because of the electricity issues, we don't know what is the quality of the vaccine going into that child? So this month we have the polio day. I just have to see the dates. I think it is the 24th of October, if I'm recalling rightly. 24th of October is the polio day. So on that day, at least do something like creating awareness within your own WhatsApp group. At least that you can start. How polio vaccine definitely needs to be given, so that, we are looking at how do we make sure our children don't suffer from a disease that they don't need in their lives. So yeah, answering that question, Rashmi, we don't have one specific program like we did under the Millennium Development Goals, but we have vaccination programs and other things running in parallel at the moment.
Thank you, ma'am.
Sure, Rashmi. Any other comments?
No,
Anything
ma'am.
that strikes you as unacceptable?
Yeah, ma'am. It's the decreasing rate, which is, as you said, it's not for decades, it's for centuries. So
Yeah.
That's what shocks the most.
Yeah. How did we let it happen? Somewhere down the line, okay, that is over. You can't do postmortem and look at it. But at least from today onwards, let us turn a new chapter and look at what can each one of us do, and make sure that that is a life's calling, and we have been of some benefit, and not have this arrogance of medicine related attitudes that we sometimes walk with a chip in the shoulder for no reason. If we are really so great, then take a look at that graph I was showing you. We won't be where we are. So I think, the one thing that we can give up is arrogance. The second thing we can definitely give up is greed, at least uncapped greed, even if we don't go to greed straight away. So thanks, Rashmi. Thanks for your comments. If
Thank you,
there's
ma'am.
nothing else, Dr. Rahul, can we close it at this? And then we will resume on Tuesday.
Yeah, yes, ma'am. We can close it.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Rahul. And thanks all of you for participating. Happy to see you all. Take care and stay healthy, stay strong. Bye for now.
Thank you.